Turn your Bibles to Acts chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. While you're turning this morning, I want to read to you what you sang. You say, really? Yeah, because you know what? I know enough to know that often we sing it and don't get it. Listen, Lord, I give my life to you. Take control each day. I will follow anywhere, near or far away. Now let me stop you for a minute. Do you realize that that's what you told God this morning? Lord, I want your perfect will. Be my faithful guide. I'll never be afraid. You're close beside. Let me see my mission field all around each day. Fill my heart with Jesus' love. Use me, Lord, I pray. Here am I, Lord. Send me. Here am I, Lord, send me. I'll serve you faithfully. Here am I, Lord. Send me. What a fitting text for the text we come to this morning in Acts chapter 27. I'm enamored with the person Saul of Tarsus. Just a man, just an instrument, just a tool. And in this passage of Scripture, God gives us another little glimpse into the fact that he's just a man. And so what we ought to marvel at when we consider his person is, look what God can do with just a man. Just a man, a broken, feeble, self-righteous, wicked-hearted man when we first meet him. And then we're going to see him in this passage of Scripture in unbelievable circumstances. I don't think Paul could ever have envisioned in his mind that on the road to Damascus, when he said, "What would you have me to do, Lord?" And Jesus tells him, "You're going to go preach the gospel before the Jews and the Gentiles and before princes and kings," that he ever envisioned this is how he was going to get there. How many of you are familiar with the old TV show Hogan's Heroes? We're in the midst of a Hogan's Heroes stint right now. And I forgot how much I enjoyed Hogan's Heroes. If you don't know the story, it's Stalag 13, a prisoner of war camp in Germany. And there is a group of prisoners there. They're made up. There's LeBeau, who is French, and then there's a British guy, and then there's Hogan. And they're all, one way or another, flyers. That's what they were doing, and they find themselves in this prisoner of war camp in Germany, and it's just a hilarious setting. But what's interesting about that is there they are in a prisoner of war camp, and the last thing that is going through their mind is getting out. They don't want to get out. They want to get everybody else out. We watched an episode last night, and in that episode, there's a factory, a munitions factory, that has to be blown up. And the Allies, for some reason, can't ever get it right. They can't hit this one munitions factory. And so these guys in this prisoner of war camp, they figure out where it's at, and they lay a plan for how they're going to blow it up. And so they manipulate the authorities that are there. And I just love Schultz. Unfortunately, he is like many believers in this world. I know nothing. I see nothing. I didn't even get out of bed this morning. But they manipulate them to get accomplished whatever it is they want to get accomplished. And it starts out, there's 2 extra prisoners. Schultz comes in and he counts and they say, how you doing today, Schultz? And he says, I'm doing really good. Everything's good. Everybody's here. In fact, there's a couple of extras. There's a couple of extras! Well, they got to find a way to get those guys out. And then they got to figure out how to blow up this munitions factory. And so they put up this whole scheme, talked the commandant into doing a contest between these Ally flyers and the German flyers, and of course the Germans are going to win, but he builds a model of an airplane, and they then take a picture of that because they know he's going to build it right, and now they see how to fly a German aircraft, and then they put together this scheme, and they bring in a German airplane, and they steal a German airplane, and they build the bombs, and they fly out having captured the German general, blowing up the munitions factory, and these 2 guys fly back to England and take captive a German general. And as they're flying after doing all of that, the guy flying the plane looks at Hogan. He says, Hogan, why don't you come to England with us? And he says to him as he's getting ready to jump out of the plane with his parachute on, don't you know there's a war going on? And he parachutes back in and goes back into Stalag 13. I use that as an illustration this morning because Paul's going to find himself in some amazingly precarious situation. He's going to find himself in the midst of a sinking ship. Peril of his life along with all the others. And by the way, we'll find that he is human. He was afraid. But the amazing thing is we see Paul in the midst of all of these circumstances, and the last thing he's thinking about is getting out. And I think there's a parallel for us this morning. It'd be easy for us as believers to look at our culture, to look at our world, to look at our country, to look at our circumstances and feel like we're in a sinking ship and begin to live life with the perspective, just survive. Just survive, and hopefully we'll find a way out. Hear me, friends. Do you realize this morning that the rapture is not presented to us as believers as our great escape? It's not what we're getting out of, it's who we're going to. God left us here in this world on purpose, with purpose. Fill my heart with Jesus' love. Use me, Lord, I pray. So we come to Acts chapter 27. And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band. Entering into a ship of Adramyttium, we launched, meaning to sail by the coasts of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonia of Thessalonica, being with us. Who's the us? Luke is writing. When you see the we in the text of Acts, Luke is back with Paul. And when you see it not there, he is off doing something else. And so Luke is here. And the next day, we touched at Sidon. And Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go unto his friends to refresh himself. Let me stop. Paul is a Roman prisoner being taken before Caesar for a capital trial. Those usually end in one of two ways, life or death. They have entrusted him as a prisoner to this guard, a centurion, a specific assigned guard to Paul. There are other prisoners, but Paul is assigned as a capital prisoner to this centurion. And we know his name, Julius. Luke knows his name. That tells me there was relationship going on here. Imagine the setting. Paul is a capital prisoner, and we don't know what has happened, but in a very, very short time, they come into port, and this guy has so embraced Paul that he says, you know what? Why don't you take a week and go see your friends? Let them take care of you. Let me ask you, if they threw you in prison today for your faith, do you think by the end of the week you'd have that kind of relationship with your prison guard? Most of us would be so angry and so bitter and so hostile and so seething that we would decry the name of the God that we're in jail for. Not Paul. Somehow this guy is the guard that's taking him to Rome, and Paul has developed a relationship with him that you're going to see become incredibly valuable when we get to the end of the story. Hey, can I give you this one little encouragement? Watch your testimony around those you see as even a possible adversary. Because God might want to use you to work in their heart. That's free. That's just like in reading. Notice, verse 4. And when he had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. And when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete, over against Salmone. And hardly passing it, came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lasea. And when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them, and said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. I want you to jump down, verse 21. After long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. Now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer. For I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. Jump down to verse 35. Verse 34. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health. For there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. When he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. Then jump down to verse 41. And falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground. And the forepart struck fast and remained unmovable. But the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. It happened just like God said. This morning, as we look at this passage, I want us to see the sovereignty of God and the salvation of men. The sovereignty of God and the salvation of men. Grace and graciousness when facing godlessness. Grace for us, graciousness from us when facing godlessness. And I probably should have added, for the glory of God. Because that's what was in Paul's heart. So let's look at this passage together. I want you to see, first of all, the setting. There's a lot of places named, and so I want you to see it. We start over here, Caesarea by the sea. And we've read the description. They move north up Asia. And the reason they do is the little ship that they're in is not a sea-going vessel. It doesn't go out into open water. It just goes port to port. And we'll go all the way around to here, but it just goes port to port. When they get to here, they decide the weather is looking pretty good. And so instead of taking this route all the way around, they make a jaunt to Cyprus. And when they get out there, there's some rough weather. So they decide to stay south. They go underneath Cyprus. And then they make their way around to Myra. Myra is a main port in that day. Why? Because the center of the world was Alexandria and Rome. Alexandria was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. It's where they grew all of their bread, grew all of their wheat. And so it's no surprise that the ships down here that are loaded with the wheat are going to make their way to Myra. And then they're going to make their way around to Rome. And so they make their way up here. And there the centurion puts them on a ship that is from Alexandria, heading to Rome to deliver wheat. Well, things look pretty good as they start out. They face some rough weather, so they go down south to get away from the cross currents from the Aegean Sea, and they take the route down underneath Crete. But now they're beginning to struggle. And when they get down here to Fair Havens, there's been a little bit of a struggle, but not much. And they determine we're going to go on. Paul says, yeah, you know what? I think we should stay right here at Fair Haven. They don't listen to him, and so they take the rest of their journey. They make their way across to Malta, and as we get into chapter 28, we're going to find our way up here. They go to Syracuse. God never wastes a storm. He could have made this smooth sailing, boom, 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 get across the sea, up to Rome, and away we go, right? But there was so much to be accomplished. I want you to see that in the midst of this story, while God was interested in Paul, God was interested in the nameless sailors on this boat. God was interested in Julius, the centurion. God was interested in the lives of these heathen, ocean-faring sailors. God wanted those men, through his servant, to know who he was. We don't know whether they were men from Egypt, that was their culture, or that they were Romans, but we know this, if they were one of either or, they didn't know the one true and living God. Coming from Egypt, they would have been caught up in the system of the pharaohs and that kind of worship, probably still, and all their false gods. Coming from Rome, they'd have been caught up in Caesar worship and all the idolatry of the Greek culture. It's no accident that in the middle of this storm, Paul says, I need you to know something. My God, the God who I claim, the only God, has said, you'll be safe. Not your gods, not your heathen deities, not your pagan rituals, my God. And notice what God does. He says, you will all be saved, but just so you know, it's not some freak accident. The boat's going to be lost. The boat's going to go down. But not one of you are going to be lost. In fact, imagine going through a storm like this and him being able to say to you, you're not even going to lose a hair. Be confident in his God. Do you? Is he your God? Do you commune with him that way? Do you have confidence in him that way? And do you look at the world around you on this sinking ship and realize that God has a message through you for them? You see, that's the setting as Paul's taking this journey. Paul is not sitting writing the notes of what he's going to say when he gets to Rome. Paul at this point becomes passionate. Why am I on this boat and who is here? What is my purpose here? What is my mission here? What needs to be accomplished here? How can God be glorified here? And folks, I'm here to tell you this morning that if we never ask those questions, we'll never answer them right. So, let's move then to the scenario which is laid out for us. And I want us to track through this scenario by the conversations of Paul. This is amazing. So let's look at the scenario. First of all, I want you to see Paul's practical advice. Paul's practical advice in verses 10 through 12. I love the language. They're struggling in the sea. They're wrestling through the circumstances. And actually, we realize they're in a democratic society. I don't know what's going on here. Paul probably didn't have a vote, or the other prisoners. But the rest of them, the Roman soldiers, these sailors that are together, they've got a decision to make, and they do it in a democratic way. Verse 9, now when much time was spent and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them and said to them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. Paul gave them practical advice. By the way, 2 Corinthians Chapter 11. Paul knew what he was talking about. Paul said in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, when describing what had taken place in his life, he said, I have been shipwrecked 3 times. He was an expert at shipwrecks. I'm not sure if he shared that with them that day. They probably should have thrown him overboard, having been in 3 shipwrecks. That's probably not good cargo. But 3 shipwrecks. He probably said, I've been out on the sea in circumstances like this. I don't know everything, guys. I'm not really a sailor. But 3 times I've been out there and the weather looked just like this. And you know what happened? We ended up swimming. He said, I've been in peril of the sea. He said this, I spent a day and a night in the open water. His boat didn't just go down. Can you imagine floating around out in the middle of the Mediterranean? No boat in sight. He's just out there floating. And by the way, I don't know what they had in that day, but I'm guessing they didn't have little orange life jackets. They certainly didn't, because the captain said, if you can swim, swim, and if you can't, grab a board. Paul knew what he was talking about. Paul's practical advice. Folks, let's take step 1. God wants his people to matter in their culture. Paul at this point has not had his visitor. Paul at this point makes a statement that he's going to undo later when he gets more revelation. He says, this is what I perceive. I perceive that this is probably not going to go well, and there'll be peril of the ship and our lives. Notice, after the angel comes to him, that has changed. Ship's going down, we're not. Because God spoke to him. But at this point, it's just practical human advice. Isn't it interesting? Like the guys at Stalag 13. They didn't want Schultz to be gone, and they didn't want Colonel Klink to be gone. Why? Because they were just the right guys for them to be able to do what needed to be done. That was manipulation. But they were concerned. Paul here is concerned. Paul could have said, hey, you know what? Maybe we'll go out in the sea today, and I've seen these conditions before. This boat's going down, and these people are going to get just what they deserve. They're going to get just what they asked for. Maybe there'll be a window. When the boat goes down, everybody will be desperate, and I'll get to escape. Instead, here's Paul with concern for them, giving them practical advice. You know what? I don't think you should do this. Oh, maybe there was some of it sourced in his own safety. But as far as he knew, he was going to go die anyway. He was concerned for them. Folks, let me ask you a question. Do you just have practical, everyday concern for the people on the sinking ship of life who are all around you? Are you involved in people's lives in such a way that you are making a practical difference? Do you realize God has given you gifts, talents, and abilities for the purpose of building life bridges to people so that you can introduce them to eternal life? Are you using those gifts, talents, and abilities to connect and make a difference in people's lives? You're an attorney. You're an accountant. You're a doctor. You're a nurse. You're a math teacher. You know something about running. You can knit. You sew. How can you use those abilities to impact people's lives in a practical way that matters so you can build a relationship? You see, at this point, Paul's no prophet. But you have to think, when they're throwing all the tackle overboard, wonder what that guy knew that I didn't know. You know, if he has anything else to say, I think I might listen. Because so far, he was right and I was wrong. But folks, if you're not involved, the best you can do is stand around when it's all said and done and say, that went just the way I thought it would. And there's too many in the church doing just that. This is not a chapter on leadership. John MacArthur's written an incredible book on leadership, and he uses this account. Think of it for a minute. Paul's the bottom rung. Paul's a prisoner. And he doesn't even get a prison ship. He gets loaded up on a wheat vessel. I mean, he's the bottom rung. The soldiers don't want to hear from him, and these sailors, they definitely don't want to hear from him. And yet look what God does. See, Paul wasn't striving to be a leader. He was simply trying to help. All of us must start there. Is there somebody that somehow I can help? His leadership wasn't viewed as spiritual leadership by those on board the ship. It was practical. He didn't have a formal position, so he adopted functional leadership. Let me find a way to help. Let me do something to get involved. Let me do something to make the situation better. And then when crisis came in the hour of need, when no one else had any answers, Paul's leadership emerged out of the need. Because he put himself intentionally in a place where he could make a difference. His influence didn't come because of political maneuverings. It wasn't about him or his position. It came because of men's response to his personal competence. But then the next big thing, what did he do with that? How easy would it have been in the middle of that stormy sea with all those people around him now looking at him to say, see, I must be innocent. I am wrongly charged. You guys ought to look up to me. And made it all about him. But you know, he didn't do any of that. He made it about God and His glory. Whatever position God might give to you, whenever finally you come to a place where God allows you to make a difference in somebody's life, whenever there does come about a situation where you have influence, why did God give it to you? Why are you there? What is it for? And so often, that's where we take our football and go home. Take the next step. Paul has practical advice that puts him in a place of making a difference. Here's the amazing thing for me. This is where my flesh gets impacted. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. Well, fine. Have it your way then. You know, it wasn't like Paul could sit on the sidelines and say, well, I'm not going. He was in for the ride, whether they were going or not. He was aboard. But imagine how his attitude could have been. Imagine now what his spirit could have been. It's one thing to know and not say anything and have it go some way and that impact your spirit. But you give them the advice and they don't take it. Now how's your spirit? Parents? Didn't I tell you? And we roll out the logic. I mean, it just comes right out of, I told you once, I told you 1,000 times. You know, that fixes everything. What about to our world? There's a whole bunch of believers in this country who the most advantageous advice they can offer to the half of our country who, in our opinion, voted wrong, the best thing we can say for them is, see, you got what you asked for. Well, whoop-de-doo. I mean, let's be real, folks. Paul could have been bitter. If you didn't listen to me, you wouldn't just be in this scenario. I wouldn't be in this scenario. He could have been angry. Why didn't you listen to me, buffoon? I tried to tell you. Don't you know I'm an expert on shipwrecks? I've got the day and a half post-shipwreck swim down. That's not his spirit. In fact, when you look at this passage of Scripture, it appears that this angel appearing to Paul in the night is in the context of Paul praying, and there's something phenomenal in this text. Paul is not just praying for deliverance. When God says to him, I'm going to give you the men that are with you, notice the language of giving them to him. It's as though Paul has been praying for them. God, yes, I want to be delivered, but I don't want these men to die. God is going to answer Paul's prayer in the midst of the dilemma. That's why he's so thrilled to come to them. Be of good cheer. I've got good news for you. You're not going to die. Folks, I'll tell you, I got kicked right in the teeth of the flesh in this one. Because so many of us, this is where we're at the point we're there. I turned the other cheek, only got two, you slap both of them now? Yeah, now you're getting it. By the way, that's not at all what Jesus meant. But somehow that becomes our spirit, isn't it? How quickly we get to the mentality of get him, God. Get him, God. Paul was concerned for their souls and knew that God would be most glorified, not through him being vindicated in their death, but through God being vindicated in their life. And so we see him give practical advice, first step. Then I want you to see Paul's passionate admonition. Verses 21 through 32, jump down there. After a long pause, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, I love this, sirs, ye should hearken to me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. Paul is not saying that to rub it in. If he were, he wouldn't have said what he says next. What he does is create the context in which they should now listen. Because the reality of it is, what he's going to say next shows that Paul didn't really know what he was talking about either. Because Paul said the boat's going down and we're going to die. But what he is saying to them is, I want you to hear what God has said. Now I exhort you to be of good cheer. For there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, fear not, Paul. You get that? Paul was afraid. Paul is just a real man, made of real stuff, in the middle of a real sea and a real sinking boat, and he was afraid. Do you know what, folks? God is not saying here that it's wrong for us to be afraid. There's real emotion. There are real circumstances. And yes, we're to, by His grace, live above them, but we live in a real world, in real life. There's times where we have real fear, and it's not replacing our faith, but the circumstances make us say, whoa. The question is, what do I do then? And I come to the place where I face real life circumstances and there is real fear. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to turn. I don't know what the answer is, and I can't see it written in the stars. What do I do then? Paul turned to God. Who do you turn to? Where do you run? Fear not, Paul. Thou must be brought before Caesar, and God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer. For I believe God that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. Look at the declaration of Paul. I want you to see, first of all, he was bold. He could have been quiet. Didn't listen to me before. You know what? God gave me the message. It's going to happen. God's sovereign, God's in control, and showed up, and God, you told me I'm going to be safe, and they're going to be safe, and so no point talking to them anymore. They're not going to believe me anyway. You realize Paul could have done it. There's nothing here that indicates that he was commanded to go and tell them, but Paul was concerned for them, and Paul was concerned for the glory of God, and that's why he goes and speaks. They're panicked, and so he steps forward with boldness into the midst of them, and he says, look here! It's literally what he says. Listen up. Now imagine, these guys who haven't listened to him already, they're sailors, and at this point they're desperate. They're cutting things off and throwing it over and trying to decide whether or not they're going to save the cargo. They're panicking. And this prisoner walks in the middle and says, let me have your attention for a minute. Yeah, right. Throw him over too. He had boldness. Folks, our sinking ship of a culture needs somebody who trusts God enough to be bold. There is right, and there is wrong. And yes, they have rejected, and yes, they have turned away from it. But hear me, the crisis is coming when they might just listen again. How long have we been crying out against the immorality of abortion in our country? By the way, let me shock you. We think Roe v. Wade and all that's happened in this country, and it's deplorable. But hear me, 20 years since the decision in China of the one-child policy, 360 million babies have been aborted in China in 20 years. Plus or minus a few, that's the population of the United States of America. Do the math. That's 60 times the number of Jews killed in the Holocaust. See, told you so. What do you think then it matters whenever now the national news is finally carrying stories about a butcher shop in Philadelphia? We can sit back in bitterness and harshness and anger and say, see, we've been telling you all along. That's what it's like. That's what they do. You got what you deserve. Or we can come back with a passionate plea and say, listen to me. There's a God in heaven who is sovereign in the affairs of men. And you can know him. That's the heart of the servant of God. Fill my heart with Jesus' love. Paul's in that place. So he speaks with boldness. He doesn't back away from truth, but he speaks. Then I want you to see that he speaks with belief. I don't care what you say. I don't care what you think. I don't care what pagan gods you worship. I don't care what temples you've gone to. I am going to tell you in the midst of this storm who my God is and what he does for me. You watch. You see. My God said, nothing's going to happen to me until he's done with me. And he told me that you'll be safe. Do you believe what your God said enough to tell the world with confidence and trust it to be true? My God said to me that I'm a sinner and I cannot save myself, and I'll never get to heaven on my own. But I know whom I have believed, and I'm persuaded that he is able to keep all that I've committed unto him against that day. He said that whosoever will may come. And he said that if any man would call upon the name of the Lord, he would save him. That he would exchange my demerit for his merit. That he would exchange my unrighteousness for his righteousness. That he would put me in the standing of a son based upon the crosswork of Jesus Christ. And when I depart this life, I'll spend eternity with him, and I believe it. And so can you. So can you. Folks, our sinking ship needs that message more than that sinking ship needed the word, you're not going to drown. Because hear me, there was a possibility that veteran sailors could go into that sea and somehow on their own survive. There is not a single soul in the sinking ship of this culture who will depart into the sea of the afterlife and survive. Not one. They'll all split hell wide open. I don't care how nice you are to them. I don't care how much you know them. I don't care how close in family they are to you. Your loved ones without Jesus Christ are going to spend eternity in hell. Do you have the boldness to tell them, do you believe God enough that he can and he will? That's why Paul spoke. And he moved from just a practical admonition to this passionate admonition. And then look what God does. See the desperation of the men. Paul speaks and the storm gets worse. And now they're really going to town. They're cutting stuff off. They bring the lifeboat up. It's hard to get that there in the context of the King James. But they pull the lifeboat up onto the boat. Somehow hoping that maybe they'll have a way of escape. Somehow to keep it out of the waves and the water. Somehow to somehow have a plan of action. They're throwing everything else out and they bring that up and they lash it down to the boat. They're desperate. They're panicking. How desperate are they? They're so desperate that these seafaring sailors who cross this sea all the time due to conditions of seasickness haven't eaten in 14 days. They're desperate. I love it when God does that. So often God brings men to the place of desperation. Imagine God promises an elderly couple that they would have a son and then waited 25 years to make sure that it would be a miracle. But that child, Isaac, came just like God said when they were desperate. God put Israel between the Red Sea and the Egyptian army so that there appeared to be no way out. And only then did God part the sea, and the Israelites passed through on dry ground, and so they talk about it to this day. Why? God made them desperate so that they would look to him. God instructed Gideon, take this great big army that, yes, by the way, is going to fight against a much greater big army. From 32,000, cut it down. Okay, God will cut her down, 16. No. Cut it down. 3,000? No. 300. By the way, just give them lamps. I love that. We don't know what a lamp was, but I just like to picture it. Can you imagine going out to fight this army that is described as being as the sands of the ground? All right, boys, here we go. Everybody's carrying a lamp. Can you imagine? They weren't lamps, but I can just picture that. I'm putting the shade over my head. I'm doing something. Okay, God, I'm going to trust you, but I don't want them to know who I am. I mean, it's just funny to think of. Why does God do that? Because Gideon, I want you and I want Israel to know in your desperation, I did it. Look to me. Paul speaks. You're going to be safe. Your hair's not even going to get messed up. It got messed up. He's using a figure of speech. No harm is going to come to you. And so you know who did it? God steps up the waves. God increases the wind. By the way, that little term, Euroclydon, that you read there, really is like a sou'easter, hurricane force wind, out of nowhere. God brings them to a point of desperation. And then I want you to see finally Paul's persuasive administration. Paul's persuasive administration. Because in the end, he comes back and he says, now are you ready to listen? I don't know why. I don't know how. But Paul says, you know what? You guys haven't been eating for 14 days. I'm not panicked. I'm eating over here. Y'all just sit down and eat lunch. But a little lunch. He demonstrates his faith. And in the midst of demonstrating his faith, notice what he does. No. You haven't eaten in 14 days. But before you jump into that, let's say grace. And he prays to the one true and living God, the God of heaven, and he gives thanks to him. And when he's done, it says they all were of good cheer. You notice Paul doesn't miss the point. He brings them right back to God. And now, you want to know what's amazing? This bottom-rung prisoner is directing the ship. They eat, they're good cheer, they sing now when they throw stuff overboard. Storm hasn't gone away, but somehow they're ready to trust in what Paul has said. And so you know what? They make an unbelievable nautical decision. They make the worst mistake you could ever make. The ship is lost if you run it nose first into the sand. Why? Because exactly what's described happening. The back of the ship that's now held fast and it's going to snap that ship in half. And it's lost. And they say, you know what? Let's run it aground at Paul's word because we believe we'll be saved. It was a sure guarantee of their shipwreck and loss. But they do like he says, and they run it aground. In fact, it says they hoist the sail so that the wind will take them right into shore. And they wedge it in, and it's all broken up. They've come to the place where they're ready to listen to Paul and abandon themselves to the sea rather than to live in their own strength on the ship. And then God does this little miracle at the end. The sailors have come to that place, but the soldiers haven't. Hey, you know what, soldiers? These prisoners escape, we're dead. That was the way it worked. Any of these guys get away, we're dead. Kill them. And we can tell them, too bad they didn't make it. We had to kill them. The centurion says, no. You're not touching them. I love Luke's writing because he tells us 276 men on board. And how many showed up at the campfire? 276. Not just like Paul said, just like God said. My friend, disobedient Christians are a danger to themselves and others. But obedient Christians are a blessing. You sang it. Here I am, Lord. Help me see my mission field all around each day. Fill my heart with Jesus' love. Use me, Lord, I pray. Did you mean it? Do you see that field around you all the time? On the sinking ship of our culture? Will you get involved? Practically build bridges? Give context? Will you then speak with boldness and belief? And then when the time comes and the storm gets worse, will you step in and give glory to God and call men's attention to who He is and what He's doing? Because we can live in this culture, be disconnected, do our own thing, live our own way, say tisk tisk, and finish in a place where disobedient believers are a danger to themselves and others. Or you can allow God to use you as He wants as salt and light, and obedient believers will be a blessing. I ask you this question. How does the sea around you look today? Stormy? God has a plan.